I trusted you." Eleanor's voice cracked as she stood in her own kitchen, staring at the young man she'd welcomed into her home. "How could you do this to me?" Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. 3 months earlier, 70-year-old Eleanor Hartwell had been sitting in her sunny breakfast nook, scanning the local newspaper's classified ads with a heavy heart. The Victorian house that had been her sanctuary for 4 years suddenly felt enormous and empty. Her husband Robert had passed away 6 months ago, and the silence echoed through rooms that once buzzed with family dinners and holiday gatherings. "Maybe I should get a tenant," she murmured to herself, circling a few rental listings with her pen. The basement apartment had its own entrance and had housed Robert's workshop for decades. Converting it wouldn't be too difficult, and the extra income would help with the mounting bills. Eleanor had always been practical. As a retired librarian, she appreciated order and careful planning, but lately everything felt overwhelming: the house maintenance, the finances, the crushing loneliness that settled over her each evening. Like a heavy blanket, 2 weeks later, she posted her own ad: "Cozy basement apartment available. Quiet neighborhood. Perfect for responsible professional. References required." The responses came quickly, but most seemed unsuitable: students looking to party or people whose references didn't check out. Then came the email that changed everything. "Dear Mrs. Hartwell," it read, "I saw your listing and would love to discuss renting your apartment. I'm a 28-year-old marketing consultant who travels frequently for work. I value quiet, respectful living arrangements and would be an ideal tenant. I can provide excellent references and would be happy to meet at your convenience. Sincerely, David Chen." When David arrived for the viewing, Eleanor was immediately charmed. Tall and well-dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and pressed khakis, he had an easy smile and impeccable manners. He complimented her garden, asked thoughtful questions about the neighborhood, and even helped her carry in groceries from her car without being asked. "My grandmother lived in a house just like this," he said, running his hand along the polished banister. "She always said these old Victorians had soul." Eleanor's heart warmed. Here was a young man who appreciated the things she valued. His references were glowing. Former landlords praised his cleanliness and reliability, and his employer confirmed his position and excellent character. "The apartment is yours if you want it," Eleanor found herself saying that very afternoon. David moved in the following weekend with minimal belongings, just a few suitcases and some electronics. "I believe in living simply," he explained. "Too many possessions weigh you down." In those first weeks, David seemed like a godsend. He was quiet, always paid his rent early, and went out of his way to help Eleanor. When her kitchen faucet started leaking, he fixed it without being asked. He carried her heavy laundry baskets, and even helped her organize Robert's remaining belongings in the garage. "You don't have to do all this," Eleanor protested, though she was deeply grateful. "It's no trouble at all, Mrs. H," David said with that winning smile. "We're neighbors. We look out for each other." Mrs. H, the nickname, made her feel like family, something she desperately missed. As autumn arrived, David's helpfulness evolved into something more involved. He began offering to run errands for Eleanor, picking up her prescriptions and groceries. When she mentioned struggling with her online banking, he volunteered to help her set up automatic bill payments. "These websites can be so confusing," he said sympathetically, sitting beside her at her computer. "Let me show you some shortcuts." Eleanor watched as his fingers flew across the keyboard, impressed by his technical skill. Within an hour, he'd streamlined her entire financial system. "You're a lifesaver," she said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." What Eleanor didn't notice was how David's eyes had lingered on her account balances, or how he'd carefully noted her passwords when she wasn't looking. Across the street, Margaret Torres had been watching these developments with growing unease. At 68, Margaret had been Eleanor's neighbor and friend for over 20 years. She'd noticed the young man's constant presence around Eleanor's house and didn't like what she saw. "There's something not right about that boy," Margaret confided to her daughter Lisa during their weekly phone call. "What do you mean, Mom?" Lisa asked. She was a successful attorney in the city, always busy but devoted to her mother. "He's too helpful, too charming, and Eleanor's become so dependent on him. She used to be so independent, but now she won't make a move without asking his opinion." Lisa frowned, though her mother couldn't see it through the phone. "Maybe she's just grateful for the company." "Loneliness can make people vulnerable. That's exactly what I'm worried about," Margaret said. Margaret's concerns deepened when she noticed changes in Eleanor's routine. Her friend, who had always been social and active in community events, began declining invitations. When Margaret invited her to their monthly book club, Eleanor hesitated. "David thinks I should be more careful about going out at night," Eleanor explained. "He says there's been an increase in crime in the neighborhood." Margaret hadn't heard of any crime increase, but she held her tongue. She began paying closer attention to the comings and goings next door. Meanwhile, David was systematically gaining more access to Eleanor's life. He convinced her to add him as an authorized user on her credit card for emergencies, and suggested she give him a spare key to the main house in case something happens. "You live alone, Mrs. H," he said with apparent concern. "What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? I could check on you, make sure you're safe." Eleanor's children lived in other states and visited infrequently. David's offer felt like a safety net she hadn't realized she needed. What started as small purchases on Eleanor's credit card, groceries for both of them, gas for errands he ran on her behalf, gradually escalated. David began ordering expensive electronics and clothing online, always with reasonable explanations. "I'm upgrading your internet security," he'd say, showing her a new router. "And I got you this tablet so you can video chat with your grandchildren." Eleanor never questioned the charges. David handled so many of her affairs now that she'd stopped reviewing her statements carefully. When she did glance at them, the amounts seemed reasonable, and David was always there to explain any discrepancies. But Margaret Torres was keeping her own careful records. From her kitchen window, she watched as delivery trucks arrived almost daily at Eleanor's house. She saw David carrying boxes and packages, always when Eleanor was taking her afternoon nap or had gone to her doctor's appointments. "Something's not adding up," Margaret muttered to herself, jotting down license plate numbers and delivery company names in a small notebook. The breaking point came on a crisp November morning. Margaret was pruning her roses when she heard raised voices from Eleanor's house. Through the thin walls, she could make out Eleanor's distressed tone and David's urgent, placating responses. "I don't understand these charges," Eleanor was saying. "This says I spent $3,000 at an electronics store, but I never Mrs. H." "You're getting confused again," David's voice carried clearly. "Remember? We talked about upgrading your home security system? You said you wanted the best protection available." "I never said that," Eleanor insisted, her voice growing shrill. "I can't afford $3,000 for anything." Margaret's blood ran cold. She'd suspected financial abuse, but hearing Eleanor's distress confirmed her worst fears. She immediately went inside and called her daughter. "Lisa, I need you to come home this weekend," Margaret said without preamble. "Something's very wrong next door, and Eleanor needs help." Lisa had learned to trust her mother's instincts. "I'll drive up Friday evening, don't do anything until I get there." But Margaret couldn't sit idle while her friend was being exploited. That afternoon, when David left in his car, she knocked on Eleanor's door. Eleanor answered with red-rimmed eyes and a tissue clutched in her hand. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so glad to see you." "Honey, what's wrong?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she knew. Eleanor broke down completely. Through her tears, she explained how her finances had become increasingly complicated, how David managed everything now, and how she'd discovered charges she didn't remember making. "He says I'm getting forgetful," Eleanor sobbed. "Maybe I am. Maybe I did agree to these purchases and just don't remember." Margaret took her friend's hands. "Eleanor, you are one of the sharpest people I know. If you don't remember making these purchases, it's because you didn't make them." "But David's been so good to me," Eleanor protested weakly. "He takes care of everything. I don't know how I'd manage without him." "That's exactly the problem," Margaret said gently. "He's made you dependent on him, and now he's taking advantage of that trust." Eleanor's face crumpled. "What am I going to do? I can't prove anything. He'll just say I'm a confused old woman." "We're going to figure this out," Margaret promised. "My daughter Lisa is coming this weekend. She's a lawyer, and she'll know what to do." Friday evening, Lisa Torres arrived at her mother's house with a briefcase full of legal documents and a determination to help Eleanor. At 42, Lisa had built her career on protecting vulnerable clients from exactly this kind of exploitation. "Tell me everything," Lisa said, settling into Margaret's living room with Eleanor and her mother, his increasing control over her finances and the mysterious charges appearing on her accounts. Lisa took careful notes, asking pointed questions about documentation. "And timelines. Do you have access to your financial statements?" Lisa asked. Eleanor nodded. "David usually handles them, but I still get copies in the mail. We need to see those statements and we need to document every suspicious transaction," Lisa said. "But first, we need to get into your house without David knowing. He leaves every Saturday morning, around 9, and doesn't come back until late afternoon. Says he visits his sick aunt across town." "Perfect," Lisa said. "Tomorrow morning we're going to conduct our own investigation." Saturday morning arrived, cold and overcast. Margaret and Lisa watched from the kitchen window as David's car pulled out of the driveway right on schedule. They waited 10 minutes, then crossed the street with Eleanor. Inside Eleanor's house, the evidence of David's deception was overwhelming. The living room was filled with expensive electronics, still in their box as a large-screen television, gaming consoles, high-end speakers and computer equipment that Eleanor clearly had no use for. "I've never seen most of this stuff before," Eleanor whispered, staring at the accumulation of gadgets. Lisa was photographing everything with her phone. "These are all recent purchases, based on the packaging. To your accounts." Lisa's trained eye quickly identified the pattern of abuse. Then gradually larger purchases, always with gaps of a few days between transactions to avoid suspicion. "Look at this," Lisa said, pointing to a series of charges. $3,000 for electronics, $1,500 for clothing, $800 for restaurant bills. "Eleanor, do you remember making any of these purchases?" Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I trusted him completely. How could I have been so foolish?" "You weren't foolish," Margaret said firmly. Lisa was adding up the fraudulent charges on her calculator. "We're looking at over $20,000 in unauthorized purchases over the past 2 months alone." The sound of a car door slamming made them all freeze. Through the window, they could see David returning much earlier than expected, carrying what looked like shopping bags. "Quick," Lisa whispered. "Eleanor, you need to act normal. Don't let him know we've discovered anything. Margaret and I will go back across the street, but we're calling the police." Eleanor's hands trembled as she tried to compose herself. What if he realizes something's wrong? Ends today. Margaret and Lisa slipped out the back door just as David entered through the front. From Margaret's kitchen window, they watched as David seemed to sense something was different. He moved through the house more quickly than usual, his easy confidence replaced by nervous energy. "He knows," Margaret said grimly. Lisa was already on the phone with the police, explaining the situation and requesting that an officer come to take Eleanor's statement. While they waited, David emerged from Eleanor's house carrying several boxes to his car. Even from across the street, they could see her distress as she confronted David. "Where are you taking those boxes?" Eleanor's voice carried across the quiet street. "Just cleaning up, Mrs. H," David called back, but his usual charm was noticeably strained. "Making more space for you." "I want to see what's in those boxes," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. 3 months of manipulation and gaslighting were finally breaking down under the weight of truth. David's mask began to slip. "You're being paranoid, Eleanor. This is exactly what I was worried about. You're getting confused and suspicious." "I'm not confused," Eleanor shouted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I know what you've been doing. I've seen my credit card statements. I've seen all those purchases I never made." David's expression turned cold, all pretense of caring abandoned. "You can't prove anything, old woman. Who's going to believe you over me?" A grieving widow with memory problems against a young professional with excellent references. But David had made a crucial mistake. His raised voice and aggressive posture had attracted the attention of other neighbors, and Eleanor was no longer the isolated, dependent woman he'd been manipulating for months. "I believe her," came Margaret's voice as she and Lisa crossed the street. David's face went pale as he recognized Lisa's professional demeanor and the authority of the uniformed officers approaching. "Officers," Lisa said, presenting her business card. "I'm an attorney representing Mrs. Hartwell. We have evidence of significant financial fraud and elder abuse." The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of justice. Lisa presented the documented evidence to the police while Eleanor gave her statement with Margaret's supportive presence. David's attempts to explain away the charges fell apart under professional scrutiny. When the officers searched David's car, they found not only Eleanor's belongings but evidence of similar scams involving at least 2 other elderly victims in neighboring towns. David Chen, it turned out, wasn't even his real name. "This appears to be an organized operation," one officer explained to Eleanor. "You're lucky your neighbors were paying attention. Many victims of this type of fraud never recover their losses." As David was led away in handcuffs, he made one final attempt at manipulation. "Mrs. H, you know I cared about you. Don't let them turn this into something it wasn't." Eleanor looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady and clear. "You never cared about me? You saw a lonely old woman and thought you could take advantage. But you underestimated me, and you underestimated the people who truly care." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and financial recovery. Lisa worked tirelessly to reverse the fraudulent charges and helped Eleanor implement safeguards to prevent future exploitation. Most of the merchandise was recovered and returned to stores, resulting in nearly full restitution of Eleanor's stolen money. But the most important recovery was Eleanor herself. The experience, though traumatic, had restored her confidence and reminded her of her own strength. She'd stood up to her abuser and refused to be victimized. "I feel like myself again, Eleanor," told Margaret one afternoon as they sat in Eleanor's newly reclaimed living room, sharing tea and homemade cookies. Margaret smiled. "You were always yourself, honey. You just needed to remember how strong you are." Eleanor had also reconnected with her children, who were horrified to learn how isolated their mother had become. They established a regular schedule of calls and visits, ensuring she'd never again be so vulnerable to predators. The basement apartment remained empty for several months, while Eleanor enjoyed her solitude and independence. When she finally decided to rent it again, she implemented strict screening procedures and maintained clear boundaries with tenants. David, whose real name turned out to be Derek Martinez, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for elder fraud and identity theft. The investigation into his activities led to the arrest of 2 accomplices and the recovery of stolen funds for several other victims. 6 months after the ordeal, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. A young woman in her 20s knocked on her door, nervous but determined. "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Sarah Chen. Derek used my brother's identity for his fake references. I wanted to apologize and make sure you were okay." Eleanor invited Sarah in for coffee, and they talked for hours. Sarah explained how Derek had manipulated her family as well, using her absent brother's good name to create false credentials. "I've been following the court case," Sarah said. "I'm so glad you found the courage to fight back. You probably saved other people from going through what you did." As Sarah left that afternoon, Eleanor realized that her ordeal had created unexpected connections and purpose. She began volunteering with local senior services, educating other elderly residents about financial scams and manipulation tactics. "The best way to heal from being victimized," she told her audiences, "is to make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Margaret often attended these presentations, beaming with pride at her friend's transformation from victim to advocate. Their friendship had deepened through the crisis, proving that sometimes the best support comes from those closest to home. On a warm spring evening nearly a year after David's arrest, Eleanor sat in her garden with Margaret, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Her house felt like a sanctuary again, filled with family photos, her own chosen belongings, and the peaceful quiet of genuine solitude rather than imposed isolation. "Do you ever regret renting to him?" Margaret asked. Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I regret the money he stole and the trust he violated, but I don't regret learning how strong I am or how much people care about me. Sometimes the worst experiences teach us the most valuable lessons." Margaret raised her teacup in a toast to surviving, thriving, and never underestimating the power of good neighbors. Eleanor clinked her cup against Margaret's, smiling at the truth of those words. She'd learned that real security didn't come from helpful strangers or convenient solutions, but from genuine connections with people who valued her for who she was, not what they could take from her. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor felt grateful for the quiet evening, her true friend beside her, and the hard-won wisdom that would protect her in all the years to come. She was no longer the lonely widow who had placed that rental ad. She was a survivor, an advocate, and a woman who knew her own worth. The Victorian house settled around them with its familiar creaks and sighs, a home reclaimed and a life rebuilt. On the foundation of authentic care and mutual respect, Eleanor Hartwell had learned that the best tenants in her life weren't those who offered convenience, but those who offered genuine friendship without expecting anything in return. Thank you for listening until the end of the story. Please, leave a like if you enjoyed it. This helps us reach more people.